The fluorescent lights of the Ernst and Young building on London's South Bank cast a sterile, unwavering glow, a light Joyce Vincent had once found synonymous with ambition and progress. It was the soundtrack to her ascent, a hum that promised a future meticulously built. But on this particular Tuesday in late 2000, the hum felt like 1,000 tiny drills boring into her temples, each flicker of the tubes an irritating spark against her frayed nerves. Before her, Delphine Baptiste stood with a stillness that was more unnerving than any outburst. Delphine, one of the cleaning staff whose contract Joyce, in her capacity as a facilities manager, was tasked with terminating. Delphine was a woman etched by time, and a son Joyce had only ever seen in glossy travel brochures. Her face, a tapestry of deep lines and knowing creases, usually held a downcast, almost invisible deference. Today, however, her dark, almond-shaped eyes, the color of old coffee, were fixed on Joyce with an intensity that felt like a physical weight. They were eyes that seemed to see more than the polished veneer of Joyce's professionalism. They saw perhaps the small, anxious flutter in Joyce's chest. "It's not a personal decision, Delphine," Joyce began, her voice smoother than she felt, the practiced cadence of corporate detachment. She gestured vaguely towards the sheaf of papers on her expansive mahogany desk. "There are budgetary constraints, a significant departmental restructuring. I'm sure you understand the broader economic climate." Delphine did not speak. Her hands, gnarled and strong from years of manual labor, were clasped tightly before her floral, slightly faded apron. A faint, almost imperceptible scent of bleach and something earthier, like damp soil, clung to her. Joyce, feeling the silence stretch, shuffled the papers again. "The company is, of course, prepared to offer an excellent reference, and there's a statutory severance package." A low, guttural sound rumbled deep within Delphine's chest, less a word than a vibration that seemed to make the air in the small office thicken. You cast me out," she finally said, her voice a low, gravelly rasp, rich with the lilting inflections of her Caribbean birthplace. Each word landed like a small, heavy stone. "Like common rubbish. After all my years of faithful service, scrubbing the dirt of others." Joyce felt a prickle of genuine discomfort, a sensation that went beyond the usual awkwardness of these conversations. "Delphine, please understand, this decision comes from higher up. It's not solely mine." She tried to meet those burning eyes, but found her own gaze faltering, drawn instead to a small, intricately carved wooden bird Delphine wore on a leather thong around her neck. "The company is but a name, Miss Vincent," Delphine retorted, her thin, dark lips curling almost imperceptibly. "It is made of people, people who make choices, people who wield power, however small. You choose to be the hand that pushes me into the cold." Her gaze hardened, and a strange, cold light flickered within their depths. "You will learn what it is to be discarded. You will understand what it is to be utterly alone." A genuine shiver traced its way down Joyce's spine, cold and sharp. "That's an inappropriate and threatening thing to say, Delphine." Delphine's eyes narrowed to slits, her head tilting slightly, like a curious bird of prey. "Oh, I call upon things, Miss Vincent," she whispered, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop a degree. "Things that crawl in the shadows, things that whisper in the silence when you think you are safe. Things you cannot see, but they will see you. Every inch of you." She took a deliberate step backward, her presence still dominating the sterile space. You will feel the chill of true isolation, the one that seeps into your bones. You will be surrounded by the cacophony of this city, but no one will hear your screams. You will grasp for connection and find only air. You will have all the trappings of a life, and then, piece by piece, it will turn to ash in your mouth. And when you are at your most alone, your most abjectly terrified, then, and only then, will you comprehend the void you have created for me. With that pronouncement, heavy with an ancient-sounding finality, Delphine Baptiste turned with a slow, deliberate grace and walked out of Joyce's office. She didn't slam the door. She closed it softly, leaving behind an unnatural, ringing stillness and the lingering, unsettling scent of damp earth. Joyce let out a shaky breath she hadn't realized she was holding, her heart thumping a nervous rhythm against her ribs. "How utterly dramatic," she muttered to the empty room, reaching for her lukewarm tea, her hand trembling slightly. Just the bitter parting shot of a disgruntled employee. Nothing more than words. But Delphine Baptiste was far more than just a cleaner. In her cramped, dimly lit flat in Seven Sisters, a world away from the gleaming towers of the South Bank, she was Mambo Delphine, a priestess of Vodou. Her small living room was a sanctuary, alive with the flickering orange glow of countless candles, their flames dancing and casting long, distorted shadows on walls adorned with colorful, hand-stitched tapestries depicting various loa. The air was thick, almost viscous, with the mingled scents of burning sage, sweet tobacco, strong rum, and a potent, unfamiliar incense that prickled the nostrils. A concoction of dried herbs, rare resins, and powdered roots she'd carefully sourced from specialist shops in Brixton Market and from contacts back home. The dismissal from Ernst & Young was not merely a job loss. To Delphine, it was a profound act of disrespect, a severing of a bond, however transactional, that Joyce had initiated by hiring her department and then carelessly, cruelly terminated. It was an insult to her dignity, to her labor, and, in Delphine's deeply spiritual worldview, an imbalance that cried out for correction. "She sweeps away the hand that cleanses," Delphine chanted, her voice a low, resonant hum that seemed to vibrate from the very floorboards. She knelt before a small, makeshift altar laden with offerings, a bowl of cornmeal, a glass of dark rum, a lit cigar whose smoke curled lazily towards the ceiling, and a collection of smooth, dark stones. With practiced, deliberate movements, she began to draw a vive on the floor with the cornmeal, an intricate, symmetrical symbol, part sacred geometry, part spiritual signature, designed to summon a specific entity. This was no gentle plea for guidance, no request for blessings. She was reaching deep, tapping into currents of power that were old, primal, and unforgiving. She wasn't merely inviting misfortune upon Joyce Vincent. She was meticulously weaving a tether of spiritual dread. "I bind her comfort. I bind her joy. I bind her tenuous peace," Delphine intoned, her eyes closed, her body swaying gently to an internal rhythm. In her hands, she cradled a small, crudely fashioned doll. It was made from scraps of dark fabric, stitched together with coarse black thread. Its most crucial component, however, was invisible. A tiny, almost microscopic fleck of skin, a few strands of hair meticulously collected from a discarded paper towel Delphine had retrieved from Joyce's office waste bin weeks prior, a small, almost insignificant piece of Joyce's physical essence. Now it was the anchor. I call upon the shadow that walks unseen, the breath that chills the living heart, the whisper that sows madness. Delphine continued, her voice dropping to a guttural whisper. Let it cleave to her, a second skin of fear. Let it whisper her deepest anxieties into her ear when the city sleeps. Let it show her the true, terrifying face of absolute aloneness, the emptiness she so casually inflicts. She chose a long, rusted needle, its point lethally sharp. A theatrical wince accompanied the prick to her thumb, drawing a single, dark bead of blood. She let it fall onto the doll's chest, where it soaked in instantly, a stark, crimson blemish. No swift end. She rasped, her voice thick with chilling satisfaction. The suffering is the lesson, to hollow her from within, to make her a screaming conduit of pure fear, until her own treacherous heart collapses from the unrelenting terror. She named the entity she sought to leash to Joyce, a Tidjuet Dyab, a small malevolent trickster demon, a spirit that delighted in psychological torment, feeding on escalating dread and despair. These were not the grand Loa of the Vodou pantheon, but lesser, more parasitic beings, easily angered and eager to latch onto human frailty. Go to her, Delphine commanded, her eyes snapping open, burning with fierce intent as she stared at the doll. Make her your stage, your plaything. Show her the desolation she has sown. Let her reap the harvest of her own callousness. The candles around the room suddenly flared, their flames leaping high, casting wild, dancing shadows that writhed like tormented spirits. A cold, unnatural draft swept through the flat, rustling the tapestries and making the small collection of bones and feathers on her altar rattle, though the windows were tightly shut against the London chill. Delphine smiled, a slow, grim, deeply satisfied expression spreading across her face. The air crackled with a discharged energy. The work was done. The tether was forged. Joyce Vincent tried with all the force of her pragmatic, ambitious nature to shake off Delphine's parting words. She dismissed them as the theatrical ramblings of a bitter, superstitious old woman. Yet they clung to her subconscious like insidious burrs resurfacing at odd moments, in the quiet of her flat late at night, or during a lull in a busy meeting. She redoubled her efforts at work, immersed herself in the vibrant, ever-shifting social landscape of London. She was young, attractive, intelligent, and possessed an adaptable charm that allowed her to navigate diverse social circles with ease. She dated a string of eligible, if ultimately forgettable, men. She moved flats frequently, from Clapham to Kilburn, then to a more upscale place in Maida Vale, always seeking something newer, something better, a tangible manifestation of her upward trajectory. She was a social chameleon, adept at reinvention, at presenting the version of herself she felt each situation required. But the unease, the tiny seed of disquiet Delphine had planted remained, a low, persistent hum beneath the surface of her meticulously curated life. It began insidiously, almost imperceptibly, a persistent cold spot in her otherwise centrally heated Maida Vale flat, a specific corner in the living room that even the afternoon sun couldn't seem to warm. She'd turn up the thermostat, check for drafts, but the chill remained, localized and unsettling. Then came the distinct, unmistakable feeling of being watched when she was alone, reading or watching television. The hairs on her arms would prickle, Her neck would tense, and she'd whirl around, heart thudding, only to find the room empty, silent, exactly as she'd left it. Small objects began to misbehave. A book she was certain she'd left on the bedside table would be found neatly placed on the kitchen counter. Her keys, always hung on a specific hook by the door, would turn up in her coat pocket or, more disconcertingly, inside the fridge. Once, a framed photograph of her and her sisters, taken years ago on a rare family holiday, fell from the wall, the glass shattering into 1,000 tiny shards, though no one had been near it. She attributed these incidents to her own increase in forgetfulness, the mounting stress of her demanding job, the inherent chaos of frequently moving. Losing my mind, she joked to herself, but the laughter felt hollow. The whispers started a few months later. At first, she dismissed them as auditory illusions. The creaks and groans of an old building settling, the muffled sounds of neighbors through the walls, the distant hum of London traffic. But these sounds were different. They were too close, too intimate. Her name sighed on the very edge of hearing as she drifted into the uneasy twilight of sleep. "Joyce," it would breathe, a drawn-out ethereal sound. "So alone now, aren't you, Joyce? All alone." She would snap awake, heart hammering against her ribs, a cold sweat prickling her skin. The room would be utterly silent, bathed in the orange glow of the streetlights filtering through her curtains. Empty. The logical Ernst and Young part of her brain, the part that dealt with complex financial projections and rational decision-making, screamed that it was stress, anxiety, and overactive imagination fueled by too much coffee and too little sleep. But another part, a primal, shivering core of her being, remembered Delphine Baptiste's eyes, the chilling certainty in her voice, her cold, unequivocal promise of isolation. The experiences began to escalate, growing more tangible, more difficult to rationalize away. Shadows, dark and fleeting, would dart at the very periphery of her vision, vanishing the instant she turned her head to look directly. Doors she was absolutely certain she had locked and double-checked before leaving for work would be found slightly ajar upon her return. One evening, her favorite, expensive bottle of Chanel No. 5, a gift from a former admirer, inexplicably slid from the smooth, flat surface of her dressing table and shattered on the polished wooden floor. The scent, usually a comfort, her signature, then seemed to follow her for days, but subtly, horridly altered, still recognizable but tainted with an underlying cloying sweetness, like overripe fruit on the verge of decay, and a faint, metallic tang. She began subtly at first, then more noticeably, to withdraw. How could she possibly articulate these experiences to her friends, the ambitious, hard-partying crowd she moved with? They'd exchange knowing glances, suggest she see a doctor, perhaps a therapist. Or worse, they'd laugh. Her family, primarily her 4 older sisters, were already somewhat estranged. Joyce was fiercely independent, a trait they sometimes interpreted as aloofness, and she, in turn, found their well-meaning concern intrusive. There were old hurts, unspoken resentments, the complex tapestry of any family. Explaining this creeping, inexplicable dread to them felt impossible. The idea of them hearing the tremor in her voice, seeing the fear in her eyes, was unbearable. The entity, Delphine's insidious Tijuet Diab, seemed to thrive on her isolation, subtly nudging her further into its embrace, and it was succeeding with horrifying efficiency. She moved again, this time to a small bedsit in Wood Green, situated above the bustling, cacophonous shopping city. It was a significant step down from her Maida Vale apartment. Smaller, decidedly less glamorous, the constant noise from the shopping center below a jarring contrast to the relative quiet she was used to. But she hoped, with a desperation that surprised her, that a complete change of environment, a less historied space, might somehow dispel the oppressive, suffocating atmosphere that had become her unwelcome shadow. She tried to make it a sanctuary, a fresh start. She bought new, cheerful bedding, a small television, and in a burst of wistful optimism that autumn of 2003, she purchased Christmas presents for her sisters and nieces, wrapping them meticulously with brightly colored paper and ribbons. They sat in a hopeful pile in the corner, a tangible representation of her unvoiced desire to reconnect, to bridge the growing chasm. But the entity, Delphine's ethereal tormentor, was not bound to a specific location. It was latched onto her, to the very essence Delphine had captured in that crude doll. The wood green bedsit, far from being a sanctuary, rapidly transformed into a crucible of escalating terror. The whispers were no longer on the edge of hearing. They were clearer, more defined, laced with a chilling, intimate knowledge of her deepest insecurities, her most private fears. "No one truly cares, Joyce," they'd hiss as she tried to read, the words seeming to curl around her like a cold fog. "They've all forgotten you. You pushed them away, didn't you? Always so proud, so independent. Now look at you." Sometimes she would hear faint, mocking laughter, seeming to emanate from within the very walls of the small room, or from the empty space beside her in the narrow bed. It was a dry, rustling sound, like dead leaves skittering across pavement. Her own reflection became a source of profound distress. Glancing into the small bathroom mirror or catching her image in the darkened screen of the television, she would sometimes see, for a terrifying, fleeting microsecond, a face that wasn't quite hers. The eyes would be darker, hollower, devoid of light, and a subtle, cruel sneer would twist the lips. She'd blink hard, splash water on her face, and her familiar features would return. But the after-image, the chilling possibility of that other face would leave her trembling, her breath catching in her throat, relentlessly chipping away at her already fragile sense of sanity. She stopped answering her phone altogether. The insistent ringing would pierce the oppressive silence of her flat, each call a potential lifeline she no longer felt capable of grasping. Letters from her sisters, concerned by her prolonged silence, lay unopened with the mounting pile of bills and junk mail pushed through the letterbox. The thought of trying to explain, of having them hear the pervasive tremor in her voice, the underlying edge of hysteria, was simply too much. The demon, it seemed, was methodically severing every thread of connection to the outside world, ensuring her complete and utter isolation. It fed voraciously on her growing fear, her deepening despair, her crushing loneliness. And in turn, it amplified these emotions 100-fold, creating a horrifying feedback loop of terror. Her physical health deteriorated. Sleep became a nightly battleground, fraught with vivid, terrifying nightmares from which she would awaken gasping, drenched in sweat, the mocking whispers her only company. Dark circles formed under her eyes, stark against her paling skin. Her asthma, a condition she'd managed for years, grew significantly worse, the attacks more frequent, more severe. triggered by the slightest stress or even by the sudden, inexplicable drops in temperature that heralded the entity's intensified presence. She lost weight, her once stylish clothes hanging loosely on her thinning frame. One particularly bleak November evening, as a cold, persistent rain lashed against her window, she sat huddled on her small sofa, the television flickering with mindless, garish quiz shows, a desperate attempt to drown out the silence and the whispers. Suddenly, a cold so profound, so unnatural, seeped into the room that her breath began to mist in the air, despite the small electric heater glowing in the corner. The television crackled loudly, the picture dissolving into a chaotic snowstorm of static, then reforming into a grotesque, slow-motion parody of the smiling contestants, their faces distorted, their eyes vacant. A low, guttural growl rumbled from the darkest corner of the room, a sound that vibrated not in her ears, but deep within her chest, in her very bones. Joyce squeezed her eyes shut, her hands flying up to cover her ears, though the sound seemed to bypass them entirely. "Go away," she whispered, her voice a hoarse, broken croak. "Please, I beg you, leave me alone. What do you want?" A sibilant hiss, like air escaping from a punctured lung, answered her, seeming to curl around her ear, intimate and chillingly triumphant. "Alone? But you are my purpose, Joyce. My sole entertainment. And what I want, I am already taking." Her asthma flared with a vengeance, her chest constricting as if caught in an iron vice. She fumbled desperately for her inhaler on the cluttered coffee table, her hands shaking so violently she could barely grip the plastic casing. The air in the room grew heavier, more viscous, pressing down on her, making each ragged breath a monumental, agonizing struggle. The shadows in the room, always present at the periphery, began to deepen, to coalesce, not into a distinct, monstrous form from a horror film, but into something far more terrifying. An oppressive, sentient blackness, a tangible void that seemed to suck all light, all warmth, all hope from its immediate vicinity. It felt ancient, incalculably malicious, and utterly, singularly focused on her. She could feel its presence now, inches from her face, a breath like grave dust, cold and carrying the faint, fetid scent of decay against her cheek. It was no longer content to merely scare her. It was actively reveling in her abject terror, drawing strength from her hyperventilating panic. Its whispers escalated into a relentless, tormenting torrent of her most deeply buried fears. Her fear of failure, of abandonment, of ultimate insignificance. "You are nothing, Joyce Vincent." The voice hissed, no longer a whisper, but a clear, cold pronouncement directly into her mind. "A forgotten speck. You will die here, in this squalid little room, and no one will know. No one will even notice you're gone. They've already moved on. You are already erased." Joyce scrabbled backward on the cheap sofa, her eyes wide and staring, reflecting the flickering static of the dead television screen. A primal scream built in her throat, but died as a choked gasp. This was it. This was Delphine's curse made manifest. It wasn't just empty words, not just superstition. It was this thing, this palpable, suffocating entity that was now her constant, unseen but horrifyingly felt tormentor. Her heart, already strained from weeks of terror and adrenaline, hammered against her ribs like a wild, trapped bird, its rhythm erratic, painful. The pressure in her chest was unbearable. No longer just the familiar constriction of asthma, but something sharper. A crushing, grinding weight, as if the entity itself were sitting upon her. A searing, agonizing pain suddenly shot down her left arm, radiating into her jaw. She gasped, her fingers clutching at her chest, her vision starting to blur at the edges. Yes! The presence seemed to sigh. A sound of dreadful, ultimate satisfaction, a chilling exhalation of pure malice. Feel it. Your own heart, finally betraying you, just as Mambo Delphine was promised. A fitting end for one who discarded others so easily. The small, cluttered bedsit began to swim before her eyes. The flickering television screen, the brightly wrapped Christmas presents in the corner, symbols of a hope now utterly extinguished. The insistent, uncaring hum of the wood-green shopping city outside her window. It all began to recede, to dim. The last thing Joyce Vincent saw with her failing sight was the oppressive, triumphant darkness before her, pressing in, consuming everything. The last thing she felt was an overwhelming, paralyzing fear that transcended all rational thought. And the last thing she heard, as her consciousness fractured and dissolved, was a soft, almost gentle, triumphant chuckle that was most definitely not her own, echoing in the sudden, profound silence of her mind. Then, nothing. Her body, no longer sustained by a terrified, racing heart, slumped sideways on the sofa. Her head came to rest against a cushion, her sightless eyes staring towards the still flickering television. The quiz show had ended, replaced by a late-night shopping channel, its presenters enthusiastically hawking costume jewelry to an empty room. Their cheerful, amplified voices filled the small bedsit, a stark, surreal, and utterly indifferent counterpoint to the profound stillness of death. December 2003. The Christmas presents Joyce had wrapped with such tentative, fragile hope lay undisturbed in the corner, their bright paper a vibrant splash of color in the dimming room. The television, her last silent companion, continued its ceaseless, flickering monologue. Outside her window, the relentless thrum of London life carried on, oblivious to the small, silent tragedy unfolding within the walls of the bedsit above the shopping center. The city, a beast of a million heartbeats, had lost one, and hadn't even registered the tremor. Days bled into weeks. The small electric heater, still plugged in but perhaps on a faulty timer, or eventually running up an unpaid electricity bill, clicked off, plunging the room into a deeper chill. Letters, innocuous at first, junk mail, circulars, began to accumulate behind the front door, pushed through the letterbox by unseen hands. Then came the more official-looking envelopes, brown and bearing stern warnings. Weeks turned into months. The milk in the small fridge, long past its sell-by date, curdled, then separated, then hardened into a pale, rubbery mass. Food left in the tiny kitchenette area, a half-eaten packet of biscuits, an apple in a bowl, began its slow, inexorable journey of decomposition. The smell, faint at first, almost imperceptible, began to permeate the small flat. It was a unique, cloying sweetness, the unmistakable odor of organic decay, subtly mingling with the lingering scent of Joyce's shattered perfume and the dust of neglect. Neighbors in the densely packed block, accustomed to the myriad smells of urban living, overflowing bins, exotic cooking, blocked drains, might have occasionally caught a faint, unusual whiff in the hallway, dismissing it as one of the many transient odors of the city. The constant low hum of the television through the thin walls, if noticed at all, likely became just another ignorable part of the building's ambient soundscape. Joyce had always been a quiet, intensely private resident. Her current absolute silence was merely an extension, albeit an extreme one, of that established privacy. No one knocked, no one inquired. Months turned into a year. The London seasons changed outside her sealed window. Spring brought a brief, hopeful warmth, summer a stifling heat that would have accelerated the processes within the room, autumn the falling leaves, and then another winter. Inside, the flesh that had once been vibrant Joyce Vincent yielded with grim biological efficiency to the relentless, unseen work of bacteria and insects.
Are you brave enough to call the dark? From the Hauntline Studios comes a vault of exclusive audio-only horror stories, so chilling you'll wish you left the lights on. No ads, no fluff, just pure, spine-tingling terror. Completely ad-free listening. Only on patreon.com/hauntline.
Soft tissues liquefied, seeped, then gradually desiccated in the fluctuating environment of the unheated, unventilated room. Her clothes, the pajamas she'd been wearing, began to meld, to fuse with the decomposing remains beneath them. The skeleton, still seated on the sofa in that eerily lifelike pose, became more prominent, the bones yellowing, draped in the remnants of fabric and dried tissue. Another Christmas came and went. The presents in the corner remained, now gathering a thicker layer of gray dust, their once bright paper faded and brittle. A poignant, heartbreaking mockery of festive cheer in a room that had become a tomb. The television screen, incredibly, still glowed. Perhaps it had been left on a news channel or a rolling broadcast, its silent, ceaseless images playing to an audience of one, long past caring. It was a ghostly sentinel, its electronic pulse the only semblance of life in the desolate space. The rent, which had been paid automatically from Joyce's dwindling bank account for a period, eventually ceased. Arrears began to mount, triggering a cascade of automated letters from the Metropolitan Housing Trust. Red-inked demands, final notices, threats of legal action, they all joined the burgeoning, silent pile behind the front door, a testament to a system that was efficient in its bureaucracy, but lacked any mechanism for human concern when the paper trail went cold. Still, no one physically checked. Joyce Vincent was a name on a ledger, a series of missed payments, a case file slowly progressing towards eviction. Another year ground by. 2005 bled into the nascent weeks of 2006. Nearly 3 years had passed since Joyce Carol Vincent had drawn her last, terrified breath, her heart finally surrendering to a terror no one else had witnessed. Delphine Baptiste, in her own small, candlelit flat in Seven Sisters, occasionally allowed herself a fleeting thought of the dismissive Miss Vincent from Ernst & Young. She felt no remorse, only a grim, profound sense of justice served, an imbalance righted according to the ancient laws her spirit understood. In her mind's eye, she pictured Joyce living a life of quiet, gnawing desperation, increasingly isolated, plagued by unease and misfortune. The insidious whispers of the Tijuet Diab her only constant, unwelcome companions. She never imagined death. The curse, as she had intended it, was for protracted torment, for a living hell that would strip Joyce of her pride and her peace. The demon, Delphine assumed, would have tired of its cruel game eventually, leaving Joyce a hollowed-out, broken shell of her former self. That, in Delphine's view, would have been a sufficient and fitting retribution. The full, skeletal finality of the outcome was beyond her imagining. Finally, the slow, ponderous gears of officialdom ground inexorably towards action. The Metropolitan Housing Trust, responsible for the bedsit in Wood Green, could no longer ignore the substantial accumulated debt and the utter lack of communication from their tenant. After numerous unanswered letters, ignored phone calls to a line long since disconnected, and the failure of standard debt collection procedures, they obtained a court order for repossession of the property. On the cold, gray morning of January 25th, 2006, a team of bailiffs arrived at the flat in Wood Green Shopping City. They were tasked with securing the premises. They knocked loudly on the door, their calls of bailiffs. "Open up." Echoing unanswered in the narrow linoleum-floored corridor. Following standard procedure for an unresponsive tenant, they used a drill to break the lock and forced the door open. The scene that greeted them was one of unimaginable, silent horror. A macabre tableau of profound urban neglect and the devastating consequences of ultimate loneliness. The first thing that assaulted their senses was the smell. Not the immediate wet stench of recent death, but a dry, musty, profoundly unsettling odor of advanced, desiccated decay, thick with the cloying sweetness of old putrescence and an overwhelming blanket of dust. It caught in their throats, making them gag. The second was the eerie, flickering blue light of the television, still on, its cheerful, inanely upbeat jingle for a daytime chat show filling the oppressive silence, a horrifyingly discordant soundtrack to the grim reality before them. And there, on the small, cheap sofa, illuminated by the ghostly glow of the TV, was Joyce, or more accurately, what remained of her. A human skeleton, almost entirely articulated, was propped against the sofa cushions, clad in the decaying remnants of what looked like pajamas or a nightgown. It was positioned almost casually, as if its owner had simply fallen asleep while watching television years ago. The skull was tilted slightly to one side, its empty sockets staring blankly towards the flickering screen. One bony hand rested near the television remote control, which lay on the dusty cushion beside it. Next to the sofa, a small pile of brightly wrapped Christmas presents lay undisturbed, their colors muted by years of accumulated grime. A heartbreakingly poignant testament to unfulfilled intentions and forgotten connections. The rest of the small room was surprisingly tidy, if coated in a thick, uniform layer of gray dust. It was the tidiness of a space long untouched by human hands. The bailiffs, seasoned men who had encountered their share of squalor and difficult situations in their line of work, recoiled in stunned, visceral shock. This was beyond anything they had ever seen or could have mentally prepared for. One of them, younger, greener, stumbled back into the corridor, his face pale, fighting nausea. The other, older and more stoic, reached for his mobile phone with a trembling hand. They called the police. The authorities arrived swiftly, uniformed officers first, then detectives, forensic specialists. The small bedsit became a carefully managed crime scene, though the nature of the crime was yet to be determined. Pathologists were called in, their faces grim as they surveyed the scene. Formal identification would require dental records, a process that would take time. But the name on the tenancy agreement, the accumulated mail, pointed to one person. Joyce Carol Vincent, aged 38 at the time of her presumed death. The cause of death, given the advanced state of decomposition, was incredibly difficult to pinpoint with any degree of certainty. An acute asthma attack, given her documented history of the condition and the presence of inhalers in the flat, was considered a strong possibility. A perforated peptic ulcer, another condition she was known to have suffered from, could also have led to a sudden, fatal collapse. Or perhaps, as Delphine Baptiste's vengeful curse had so meticulously intended, it had been a catastrophic cardiac event, a heart attack, brought on by months, if not years, of unrelenting psychological stress, chronic fear, and the severe exacerbation of her underlying health conditions. The coroner, months later, would eventually record an open verdict, unable to definitively ascertain the precise medical cause, but leaning towards natural causes, likely related to her asthma or the ulcer. There was no discernible evidence of conventional foul play, no signs of forced entry beyond the bailiffs, no obvious trauma to the skeletal remains. The discovery of Joyce Vincent's remains sent an initial ripple of shock through the local news. Then, as the full, horrifying extent of the timeline emerged, a tidal wave of disbelief and morbid fascination swept through the national and international media. How could this happen? How could a young woman die alone in her flat, in the heart of one of the world's busiest, most densely populated cities, and remain undiscovered for nearly 3 years? The story of Joyce Vincent became an instant, tragic symbol of urban isolation, of the profound anonymity of modern city life. A chilling reminder of how easily someone, anyone, could slip through the cracks of society, unnoticed, unmissed. Her family, her 4 older sisters, from whom she had become increasingly estranged over the years, were located and informed. They were engulfed by a maelstrom of emotions, profound shock, overwhelming grief, and a crushing, unbearable guilt riddled with unanswered questions and the bitter taste of what-ifs. They had tried to contact her sporadically, they said, but Joyce had always been fiercely independent, elusive, prone to periods of silence, and had a history of cutting ties and reinventing herself. She had, at one point some years before, distanced herself from them significantly, claiming she was in a difficult situation, possibly involving domestic abuse, and needed to make a clean break for her own safety. They hadn't known her exact whereabouts in those final, lonely years. The horrifying discovery brought their intermittent, worried, and ultimately fruitless searching to its most devastating and unimaginable conclusion. The flat itself, once cleared of its tragic occupant, told a fragmented, poignant story. The meticulously wrapped Christmas presents, addressed with Joyce's neat handwriting to members of her estranged family. The relative newness of her tenancy in the wood-green bedsit, suggesting a recent move, perhaps another attempt at a fresh start. And the television, that constant, uncaring electronic companion, its screen now dark, but forever seared into the narrative of her final, solitary days. No one in the ensuing media storm, no one in the official investigation ever spoke the name Delphine Baptiste, the quiet, unassuming cleaner with eyes like old, knowing stones and hands that knew more than scrubbing floors. No one knew of the cramped room in Seven Sisters, the flickering candles, the whispered incantations, the meticulously crafted doll, or the malevolent, spectral entity that had been summoned and bound to Joyce Vincent's terror. The Tijuet Diab, its dark work completed in a manner far more absolute and permanent than even its summoner had perhaps envisioned, had long since departed, sated and dissolved back into the shadows from whence it came. It left behind only the tragic, stark, and chillingly mundane reality of a forgotten death, a death that would become a byword for loneliness. The true story of Joyce Vincent is, in itself, a haunting indictment of our disconnected modern world. But perhaps, woven into the unseen, unrecorded fabric of her final, terrifying months, there existed another, darker, more supernatural thread. A thread spun from an old woman's anger, an ancient, potent tradition, and a curse whispered with chilling conviction into the indifferent London night. A curse that ensured with horrifying efficacy that Joyce Carol Vincent would indeed come to know the profound, bone-deep chill of being discarded, the crushing weight of being utterly, terrifyingly alone, and would ultimately be consumed by a fear so profound, so relentless, it could, quite literally, silence a beating heart. The images released to the press, the stark police photographs of the bedsit, often featured the television, its screen either blank or showing a frozen news report about the discovery. It seemed to stand as a silent, ghostly witness, broadcasting not just old programs but an eerie, unspoken testament to her final, unseen, unheeded moments. The dust motes, captured in the harsh glare of the forensic lights, danced in the stale air of the room, like tiny, indifferent stars in the small, dark, forgotten universe of Joyce Vincent's last earthly domain. A room where the brutal reality of urban isolation and a whispered, vengeful, fictional horror had horrifyingly, tragically converged. And somewhere, in her own solitary flat in Seven Sisters, an old woman named Delphine Baptiste may have occasionally felt a faint, inexplicable, cold tremor, a distant psychic echo of a dark promise devastatingly fulfilled, never knowing, nor perhaps wanting to know, the full, skeletal, silent extent of her chilling, terrifying success.
Are you brave enough to call the dark? From the Hauntline Studios comes a vault of exclusive audio-only horror stories so chilling you'll wish you left the lights on. No ads, no fluff, just pure, spine-tingling terror. Completely ad-free listening, only on patreon.com/hauntline.